What if the man millions believe is the most authentic Jesus ever portrayed on screen was once so lost in darkness that he nearly took his own life? What if behind those gentle eyes that have brought countless souls to tears, there was once a man who had completely abandoned God, who cursed the very name of Christ, and who fell so deep into addiction that his own family didn't recognize him anymore? What if the actor who now embodies pure love and divine grace was once found unconscious on a bathroom floor, needles still in his arm, his heart barely beating, minutes away from death? This is not the story Hollywood wants you to know. This is not the inspiring tale of a faithful man chosen to play Jesus. This is the shocking truth about Jonathan Roumie, a man who was so broken, so consumed by demons both literal and figurative, that even his closest friends believed he was beyond saving. The man who now speaks Christ's words with such power that pastors use his scenes in their sermons was once screaming at God in rage, blaming him for every pain, every failure, every moment of agony that defined his existence. But what happened next defies all logic, all explanation, all human understanding. Because in that hospital room, as doctors prepared his family for the worst, as his mother knelt beside his bed whispering desperate prayers through her tears, something impossible occurred. Something that would not only save his life but transform him into the vessel that would touch millions of hearts across the globe. The broken man who had rejected everything sacred was about to become the face of the sacred himself. Stay with us, because this is the untold story of Jonathan Roumie's miraculous transformation from the depths of hell to the heights of heaven. And what you'll discover in the next few minutes will shake you to your very core. You won't want to miss how a man who once sold his soul to darkness became the light that guides millions back to faith. Because the real miracle wasn't his recovery. The real miracle was what God had planned for him all along. If Jonathan Roumie had died that night on the cold bathroom floor, if the paramedics had arrived just 3 minutes later, if his heart had stopped beating for good, the world would have lost something it didn't even know it was waiting for. Millions of people who found their faith through the chosen would still be wandering in spiritual darkness. Countless souls who wept watching Jesus heal the broken would never have experienced that divine touch. Churches that now use his portrayal to bring people closer to Christ would still be struggling to reach hearts grown cold to the gospel. But the stakes were even higher than that. Because what you don't know yet is that Jonathan's story was never just about one man's salvation. Hidden in the shadows of his deepest despair was a divine plan so intricate, so perfectly orchestrated, that every moment of his suffering was preparing him for something extraordinary. Every needle that pierced his skin, every lie he told to get his next fix, every prayer his mother whispered in the darkness was part of a greater design that would ultimately reveal the face of Jesus to a generation that had forgotten how to believe. If he had given up that night, if the darkness had claimed him forever, then the most powerful portrayal of Christ in modern history would have died with him. The gentle voice that now speaks the Beatitudes with such authenticity that even atheists find themselves moved to tears would have been silenced. The hands that now bless children on screen with such tenderness that parents around the world pause their busy lives to watch and wonder would have turned cold and lifeless. And perhaps most devastating of all, the millions of people who desperately needed to see that redemption is possible, that God can use even the most broken vessels for his glory, would never have received that hope. Because Jonathan's transformation wasn't just about saving one lost soul. It was about proving to a hurting world that no one is too far gone, no addiction too strong, no darkness too deep for the light of Christ to penetrate. The stakes weren't just his life. The stakes were the faith of an entire generation waiting to believe in miracles again. Long before the world knew his name, before the cameras rolled and millions would see Jesus through his eyes, there was a little boy in the Bronx who carried something extraordinary within him. Jonathan Patrick Roumie was born into a home where two worlds collided in the most beautiful way. His father, a devout Egyptian Coptic Christian, carried the ancient traditions of the Middle East in his very blood. His mother, a faithful Irish Catholic, brought the fierce devotion of her ancestors to their small apartment. But what no one realized was that this child, born from the union of these two powerful Christian traditions, was destined to bridge heaven and earth in ways they could never imagine. Even as a toddler, Jonathan displayed an unsettling wisdom that made adults pause mid-conversation. His mother, Rosemary, would find him at just 3 years old, standing perfectly still in front of the large crucifix hanging in their living room, his tiny hands folded, his lips moving in whispered words she couldn't quite hear. When she asked him what he was saying, he would simply turn to her with those deep, knowing eyes and say, "I'm talking to the man on the cross, Mama." He looked sad. But it wasn't just his words that gave her chills. It was the way he said them, with a gravity that seemed impossible for someone so young. His Egyptian grandmother, Tata Samira, noticed it too. During family gatherings, while other children ran around playing, Jonathan would sit quietly beside her, listening intently as she told stories of the early Christian martyrs in ancient Egypt. But what disturbed her wasn't his attention, it was his questions. "Tata," he would whisper, "why did they have to suffer so much? Was it because God needed them to show others how to love?" These weren't questions a 5-year-old should be asking. These were the inquiries of someone who seemed to understand suffering in ways that defied his innocent years. At St. Luke's Elementary School, his teachers began calling home with concerns that weren't about misbehavior, but about behavior that was almost too good. During recess, instead of playing with other children, Jonathan would often disappear to the small chapel in the school. Sister Margaret would find him there, kneeling in perfect silence before the altar, sometimes for 30 minutes or more. When she gently asked what he was doing, he would look up with those piercing eyes and say, "I'm listening, sister." Sometimes he talks back. The elderly nun later confessed to his mother that in 40 years of teaching, she had never encountered a child who seemed to commune with the divine so naturally, so effortlessly. But perhaps the most haunting sign came when Jonathan was 7 years old. His family was watching a movie about the crucifixion during Holy Week, and suddenly, without warning, the boy began to weep. Not the normal tears of a child watching something sad, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient within him. His father tried to comfort him, but Jonathan pushed away, pointing at the screen with trembling fingers. "Baba," he cried, using the Arabic word for father, "that's going to be me someday. I can feel it. I can feel his pain." His parents exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to be concerned or amazed. How could a child so young feel such a connection to Christ's suffering? How could he speak with such certainty about a destiny he couldn't possibly understand? Years later, when the darkness would consume him and he would curse the very God he once spoke to so intimately, his mother would remember that moment. She would remember the child who seemed to carry Christ's wounds in his own small heart, and she would cling to the hope that the boy who had once felt Jesus's pain so deeply was destined to show that same Jesus to the world. But for now, in those innocent years, Jonathan was simply a mystery wrapped in the ordinary life of a Bronx family, a child who carried secrets too profound for anyone to fully comprehend. The first needle went into Jonathan's arm on a Tuesday night in Los Angeles, in a dingy apartment that smelled of broken dreams and shattered promises. He was 24 years old, and the boy who had once whispered prayers to Jesus was now injecting poison into his veins, searching for anything that could numb the unbearable weight of his existence. But what led him to this moment wasn't just the typical story of a struggling actor falling into addiction. What happened to Jonathan was far more sinister, far more devastating, because the enemy knew exactly who this young man was destined to become. It had started innocently enough when he first arrived in Hollywood with stars in his eyes and his mother's prayers in his heart. He had come to pursue his dream of acting, carrying with him the same spiritual sensitivity that had marked his childhood. But Los Angeles was a city that devoured the faithful and spat out the faithless, and Jonathan was about to discover just how quickly light could turn to darkness. The first audition rejection stung. The second one hurt deeper. By the 10th, 15th, 20th rejection, something inside him began to crack. The boy who had once felt God speaking to him directly now heard only silence when he prayed. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked night in November when Jonathan found himself standing outside a casting director's office at midnight, having waited 14 hours for an audition that lasted 30 seconds. As he walked to his car, soaked to the bone and empty-handed once again, he looked up at the dark sky and screamed words that would haunt him for years. "Where are you now?" he shouted into the storm. "I've served you my whole life, and this is what I get? Silence? Abandonment? If you're real, then why won't you help me?" The rain mixed with his tears as he pounded his fists against his car, and in that moment of rage and desperation, he made a decision that would nearly destroy him. If God wouldn't answer his prayers, he would find something that would. The descent was swift and merciless. What began as occasional drinking to numb the pain of rejection quickly escalated to harder substances. The boy who had once knelt in chapel for hours was now spending his nights in crack houses, trading his soul for temporary relief from the agony of feeling abandoned by the very God he had loved so deeply. His Egyptian father called every week, begging him to come home, but Jonathan's responses grew shorter, more distant, more hostile. His Irish mother lit candles every night at their local church, but her son was too far gone to feel the warmth of her prayers. The most devastating part wasn't the drugs themselves, but what they did to his spirit. The Jonathan who had once seen Jesus in his dreams now had nightmares filled with demons. The hands that had folded so perfectly in prayer now shook constantly, searching for the next hit. The voice that had once whispered sweet conversations with Christ now cursed God's name with a venom that shocked even the hardened addicts around him. He had become everything his childhood innocence had never prepared him for, everything his parents' faith had tried to protect him from. But the enemy's greatest victory wasn't Jonathan's addiction. It was the systematic destruction of his ability to feel God's presence. The boy who had once communed with the divine so naturally now felt completely cut off from heaven, as if an iron wall had been built between his soul and his Creator. He would sometimes find himself in churches, not to pray, but to steal from the collection boxes to buy his next fix. The sacred spaces that had once filled him with peace now felt like museums of a faith he could no longer access, reminders of a relationship with God that felt like a cruel childhood fantasy. By his 26th birthday, Jonathan was living in a world where yesterday's sins funded today's drugs, and tomorrow didn't exist. His parents didn't know that their son was shooting heroin between his toes because his arms had collapsed. They didn't know he was selling everything he owned, including his grandmother's rosary, to feed his addiction. They didn't know that the boy who had once felt Jesus's pain so deeply was now inflicting his own pain with every needle, every pill, every line of powder that promised escape but delivered only deeper imprisonment. The final descent came on a night when Jonathan found himself in a bathroom stall, preparing what he somehow knew would be his last hit. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the needle, and as he looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Staring back at him wasn't the face of the boy who had once talked to Jesus. It was the face of someone who had become the very thing that had crucified him. And in that moment of terrifying clarity, as the needle found its mark and the darkness rushed in, Jonathan whispered the last words he thought he would ever speak. "Forgive me, Jesus. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." What happened next would change everything. But the boy who had carried such divine secrets in his childhood was about to discover that even in the deepest hell, heaven had never stopped watching. Jonathan's body was found 3 hours later by a janitor who almost didn't check that bathroom stall. His pulse was barely detectable, his skin had turned an ominous shade of blue, and the paramedics who rushed him to Cedars-Sinai Hospital whispered among themselves that they were likely transporting a corpse. But what happened in that emergency room that night defied every medical textbook, every law of science, every rational explanation the doctors tried to provide. Because while Jonathan lay unconscious, teetering between life and death, something extraordinary was taking place 3,000 miles away in a small church in the Bronx. His mother, Rosemary, had been awakened at exactly 3:17 a.m. by what she later described as a voice that wasn't a voice. She found herself sitting bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding with a terror she couldn't name, but somehow knowing with absolute certainty that her son was dying. Without waking her husband, she threw on her coat over her nightgown and drove through the empty streets to St. Augustine's Church, where she had prayed for Jonathan every single day since he had left for Los Angeles. The elderly priest, Father Miguel, found her there at dawn, prostrate before the altar, her arms stretched out in the shape of a cross, weeping prayers in a mixture of English, Arabic, and what sounded like languages she had never learned. "Something's happening to my boy," she whispered when Father Miguel knelt beside her. "I can feel his soul slipping away. But God told me to come here, to hold on to him with everything I have." For 18 hours straight, she remained in that position, refusing food, refusing rest, calling out to heaven with an intensity that drew parishioners from across the city. Word spread through the community that Jonathan's mother was fighting for her son's life in a spiritual battle that seemed to transcend the physical realm. By evening, over 200 people had joined her, creating a circle of prayer that stretched beyond the church walls and into the parking lot. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, something impossible was unfolding in Jonathan's hospital room. The doctors had pronounced him clinically dead twice, but each time his heart had mysteriously resumed beating just before they could call the time of death. His brain showed no activity for over 6 hours, yet somehow his body continued to fight. The medical team was baffled, whispering about unexplained phenomena they had never witnessed in their combined decades of practice. But it wasn't just his vital signs that defied explanation. Nurses reported that his room felt different, charged with an energy that made their skin tingle and their hearts race with an inexplicable hope. Then, at exactly 9:17 p.m. Pacific Time, as his mother's prayer vigil entered its 19th hour, Jonathan opened his eyes. But these weren't the same eyes that had closed in that bathroom stall. The nurses who had seen thousands of overdose patients described something they had never witnessed before. His eyes were clear, lucid, and filled with what one veteran nurse later called the most profound peace I've ever seen in another human being. When the doctor asked him his name, Jonathan looked directly at him and said, "My name is Jonathan, and I just saw Jesus." What he described next sent chills through everyone in that room. Jonathan spoke with crystalline clarity about a journey that had taken him through darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive, followed by a light so brilliant it made the sun seem dim. He described standing before a figure whose face he couldn't quite see but whose love was so overwhelming it brought him to his knees. "He didn't speak with words," Jonathan whispered, his voice stronger than it had any right to be after what his body had endured. "But I heard him anyway. He said, 'My son, your suffering is not punishment. It's preparation. I have work for you to do.'" But the most shocking part of his testimony came when he described seeing his mother, 3,000 miles away, fighting for his soul in a church he had never visited. He described details about St. Augustine's that he couldn't possibly have known: the crack in the third stained glass window, the way the morning light hit the altar at exactly 6:45 a.m., even the exact words his mother had been praying. When the medical team called his family and Jonathan spoke to his mother for the first time in 2 years, his first words were, "Mama, thank you for holding on to me when I couldn't hold on to myself." The physical transformation was as miraculous as the spiritual one. Within 48 hours, Jonathan's body had detoxified in ways that typically took months of medical intervention. His collapsed veins showed signs of healing that his doctors called medically impossible. Blood tests that should have shown severe organ damage came back completely normal. But more than his body had been healed. The man who had cursed God's name with such venom now spoke of Christ with a tenderness that moved hardened medical professionals to tears. 3 days after his overdose, Jonathan walked out of that hospital a completely different person. Not just clean, not just sober, but transformed in ways that went beyond physical healing. The boy who had once felt abandoned by God now carried within him an unshakable certainty that he had been chosen for something extraordinary. He didn't know yet that he would become the face of Jesus for millions. He didn't know that his portrayal of Christ would bring countless souls back to faith. All he knew was that he had been given a second chance, and this time, he would not waste it. But heaven's plan for Jonathan Roumie was just beginning to unfold. The man who had been pulled back from the brink of hell was about to discover that his greatest trial had been his greatest preparation. And what awaited him would require every ounce of the spiritual strength he had gained in his darkest hour. What Jonathan didn't know as he walked out of that hospital was that his real journey was just beginning. The 7 years that followed his miraculous recovery became what spiritual directors would later call the hidden years, a time when God was sculpting him into something the world desperately needed but didn't yet know it was waiting for. During this time, Jonathan disappeared from the spotlight completely, choosing instead to live in almost monastic simplicity in a small apartment in Burbank, dedicating himself to a spiritual discipline that would have impressed the Desert Fathers. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., Jonathan would rise and spend 3 hours in prayer and meditation before the sun came up. His neighbors thought he was simply an early riser, but what they didn't see was the man who knelt on the hardwood floor of his living room, often weeping as he poured out his gratitude to the God who had saved him from certain death. His prayer routine became legendary among the few spiritual directors who knew him during this period. Father Thomas, an elderly Franciscan who became his confessor, later revealed that Jonathan would sometimes pray so intensely that he would lose track of time completely, remaining in the same position for 6 or 7 hours without realizing it. But it wasn't just prayer that marked these hidden years. Jonathan threw himself into studying the scriptures with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He learned biblical Greek and Aramaic, not just to understand the words Jesus spoke, but to feel them in the language they were originally spoken. His small apartment became a library of theological texts, commentaries, and writings of the mystics. Former roommates described finding him at 2 a.m., surrounded by open books, furiously taking notes as if he were preparing for the most important exam of his life. What he was actually doing, though he didn't know it yet, was preparing to become Jesus. The most mysterious part of these preparation years was what Jonathan called his desert experiences. Once a month, he would disappear into the Mojave Desert for days at a time, taking only water and a small amount of bread. These weren't camping trips or spiritual retreats. They were deliberate attempts to understand the solitude and temptation that Jesus himself had faced. Fellow hikers occasionally reported seeing a man alone in the wilderness, sometimes standing with arms outstretched against the setting sun, sometimes kneeling in the sand for hours, completely motionless. When asked about these experiences, Jonathan would only say, "I'm learning what it means to be completely dependent on God alone." During this time, something extraordinary began happening with his acting career. The man who had once desperately chased every audition now found roles coming to him, but only roles that aligned with his spiritual journey. He played John the Baptist in a small independent film, a role that required him to spend weeks in the wilderness preparing. He portrayed St. Francis in an off-Broadway production that ran for only 3 weeks but left audiences weeping. Each role seemed divinely orchestrated to teach him something he would need later, to strip away another layer of his former self and reveal the man God was calling him to become. But perhaps the most profound change during these years was in his relationship with suffering. The man who had once used drugs to escape pain now embraced it as a pathway to understanding Christ's passion. He began volunteering at homeless shelters, not just to serve meals, but to sit with the broken and abandoned, listening to their stories with a depth of compassion that came from his own experience of rock bottom. Former addicts found in Jonathan someone who understood their struggle not just intellectually, but viscerally. His presence alone seemed to communicate that redemption was possible, that no one was too far gone for God's mercy. His family watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. The son who had once been hostile and distant now called his mother every Sunday, not just to check in, but to ask for her prayers for specific people he was trying to help. His father, who had feared his son was lost forever, now found himself seeking Jonathan's counsel on matters of faith. But what struck them most was the way Jonathan spoke about Jesus. It wasn't the devotional language of a recovering addict grateful for salvation. It was the intimate familiarity of someone who seemed to know Christ personally, as if they had spent countless hours in conversation. The final year of this preparation period brought the most intense spiritual experiences of Jonathan's life. He began having dreams that were so vivid, so detailed, that he would wake up feeling as if he had actually walked the dusty roads of first-century Palestine. In these dreams, he wasn't watching Jesus from a distance. He was experiencing Christ's ministry from the inside, feeling the weight of divine love and human suffering simultaneously. He described to his spiritual director dreams where he could feel the texture of Jesus's robe, smell the oils used for anointing, hear the exact inflection in Christ's voice when he called the disciples. These weren't fantasies or wishful thinking. They were preparation for a role he still didn't know he was being prepared for. By the end of these 7 years, Jonathan had become something Hollywood had never seen before, an actor who didn't just study his craft, but who had been spiritually forged in the furnace of real suffering and genuine conversion. The man who emerged from this hidden period wasn't just ready to play Jesus. In ways that defied human explanation, he had become a vessel so purified, so emptied of self, that Christ could shine through him with startling authenticity. The stage was set for a calling that would change not just Jonathan's life, but the lives of millions who would see Jesus through his transformed heart. What came next would prove that every moment of his preparation, every hour of prayer, every desert experience, every tear shed in repentance, had been orchestrated by a God who knew exactly what the world needed and exactly who could provide it. The phone call that would change everything came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March 2017, while Jonathan was deep in prayer in his small Burbank apartment. On the other end was a casting director for a project called The Chosen, asking if he would consider auditioning for the role of Jesus Christ. Jonathan's response wasn't excitement or professional interest. Instead, he fell to his knees and wept. For 3 days, he couldn't bring himself to say yes. This wasn't just another acting role. This was being asked to become the face of Jesus for potentially millions of people. The man who had once cursed Christ's name now felt unworthy to speak his words, even in a performance. When he finally called back to accept the audition, his first words were, "I need you to know that if I do this, it won't be acting. It will be worship." The audition itself became a spiritual pilgrimage. Director Dallas Jenkins later revealed that from the moment Jonathan walked into the room, there was something unmistakably different about him. He carried a peace that filled the entire room, Jenkins would later say. Before he even spoke a word, we knew we were in the presence of someone who understood Jesus not just intellectually, but intimately. But the most extraordinary part wasn't Jonathan's performance of the scripted material. It was when Jenkins asked him to improvise a scene where Jesus comforts a grieving mother. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something had shifted. The words that flowed from his mouth carried such natural authority, such genuine compassion, that several people in the room began to cry. Jenkins later confessed that he forgot he was watching an audition. For those few minutes, he felt like he was actually in the presence of Christ. Getting the role wasn't a celebration for Jonathan, it was a consecration. That night, he spent the entire night prostrate before his small wooden crucifix, offering himself completely to the service of the role. His prayer was simple but profound. "Jesus, I am not worthy to speak your words. But if you can use a broken vessel like me, then take everything I am and make it disappear, so that only you remain." The first day of filming became legend among the cast and crew. As Jonathan put on the costume for the first time, something shifted not just in his appearance, but in his very being. Crew members found themselves unconsciously lowering their voices when he was in character. Children on set would approach him with a naturalness that seemed to transcend acting, as if they recognized something familiar and safe in his presence. The transformation was so complete that Jonathan himself seemed surprised by it. "Sometimes when I'm speaking Jesus's words, I feel like I'm not creating a character," he said. "I feel like I'm uncovering something that was always meant to be there." This wasn't the confidence of a talented actor finding his groove. This was the amazement of a man discovering that his entire life had been preparation for this one calling. What emerged from The Chosen wasn't just exceptional television. Viewers didn't just watch the show, they encountered Jesus through it in ways that brought them to their knees. Churches reported unprecedented numbers of people returning to faith. The man who had once been shooting heroin between his toes was now bringing healing to millions through the power of authentic faith made visible. But this was only the beginning of a ministry that would reach far beyond any television screen. What happened next defied every prediction, every entertainment industry expectation. The Chosen didn't just become a successful show, it became a global phenomenon that transcended denominations, cultures, and even religions. But the most shocking part wasn't the numbers or international acclaim. The most shocking part was what began happening to people who simply looked into Jonathan's eyes as Jesus on their screens. Letters started arriving by the thousands, then hundreds of thousands. But these weren't typical fan mail praising an actor's performance. These were testimonies of miraculous encounters with the divine. A woman in Japan wrote that she had been planning to end her life the night she stumbled across The Chosen. As she watched Jonathan deliver the Sermon on the Mount, she felt Jesus himself reaching through the screen to hold my heart. She canceled her suicide plans and now leads a Bible study in Tokyo. A hardened gang member in Sao Paulo felt like Jesus was looking right into my soul, seeing all my sins, and loving me anyway. He left the gang the next day. Perhaps the most extraordinary testimonies came from children. Parents worldwide reported that their kids would stop playing and sit quietly whenever Jonathan appeared on screen as Jesus. A mother in Alabama wrote that her autistic son, who had never spoken a complete sentence, watched Jonathan bless children and suddenly said, clear as day, Jesus loves me too. A rebellious teenager in Germany, who had rejected all things religious, watched the show and asked to be baptized the very next Sunday. What was happening couldn't be explained by good acting or clever writing. Mental health professionals began documenting cases of people finding healing from depression and trauma simply by watching Jonathan's portrayal. Addiction counselors reported breakthrough moments clients had been working toward for years. The scientific community had no framework for understanding how a television performance could catalyze such profound transformations. Churches that had been struggling to reach younger generations suddenly found their pews filled with people who had discovered faith through The Chosen. Seminary enrollment spiked globally. A prominent atheist professor at Oxford wrote an essay titled, The Jesus I Never Expected, describing how the show had shattered his intellectual objections to faith through what he called a direct encounter with divine love made visible. Jonathan himself seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening through him. He consistently deflected credit, insisting that he was simply a broken vessel that God chose to use. Those close to him reported seeing him in quiet corners after filming, praying intensely, as if asking for strength to carry the spiritual responsibility placed on his shoulders. The man who had once sold his grandmother's rosary for drugs was now inspiring people around the globe to pick up their Bibles again. The voice that had cursed God's name was now speaking Christ's words with such authority that hardened hearts melted. The transformation was so complete, so impossible by human standards, that it served as its own testimony to the power of divine redemption. And yet, even as millions found faith through his portrayal, Jonathan remained the humble man who rose at 4:30 each morning to pray, who never forgot that he was nothing more than a vessel for something infinitely greater than himself. The boy who had once whispered to the man on the cross had become the man through whom countless others would find their way to that same transforming grace. Today, when Jonathan Roumie looks in the mirror, he sees something that still amazes him. Not the face that millions recognize as Jesus, not the actor who has touched hearts around the world, but the living proof that God's mercy knows no limits. Every morning when he rises at 4:30 to pray, he remembers the man who once lay dying on a bathroom floor, and he weeps with gratitude for a grace he never deserved but desperately needed. The needle scars on his arms have faded, but he keeps them as reminders. Not of his shame, but of his salvation. When young people struggling with addiction meet him, he shows them those faded marks and tells them, "These aren't symbols of my failure. They're proof that God can resurrect anyone from any death." His testimony has become a beacon of hope for the hopeless, a living demonstration that no one is too broken, too lost, too far gone for divine redemption. But perhaps the most powerful part of Jonathan's story isn't what he overcame, but what he became. The 3-year-old boy who whispered to the man on the cross is now the man who brings that same Jesus to millions of broken hearts. The child who felt Christ's pain so deeply has become the vessel through which countless others feel Christ's love so personally. It's as if every moment of his life, every prayer his mother whispered, every tear he shed in the darkness, was part of a divine tapestry being woven by hands he couldn't see. His mother, Rosemary, now in her 80s, watches her son's work with wonder that never fades. "I prayed for God to save my boy," she says with tears in her eyes, "but I never imagined he would use my boy to save so many others." When she sees the letters that arrive daily from people whose lives have been transformed through Jonathan's portrayal of Jesus, she understands that her prayers in that church weren't just heard, they were multiplied beyond her wildest dreams. The man who once screamed at God in rage now speaks with him in intimacy. The hands that once shook with withdrawal now steady the hearts of millions. The voice that once cursed the heavens now proclaims Christ's love with an authority that comes only from having experienced the very depths of hell and the infinite heights of heaven's mercy. Jonathan Roumie has become living proof that God doesn't just forgive our past. He redeems it, transforms it, and uses it to heal a broken world. And so the boy who carried secrets too profound for his young heart to understand has become the man who shares the greatest secret of all: that love wins, that redemption is real, that no darkness is deeper than the light that conquers it. Through him, millions have discovered that the Jesus they thought was just a character in ancient stories is actually a living presence who knows their name, sees their pain, and loves them beyond measure. The transformation of Jonathan Roumie isn't just an inspiring story. It's a promise. A promise that no matter how far you've fallen, no matter how lost you feel, no matter how broken your heart has become, there is a God who specializes in resurrections, who turns ashes into beauty, who transforms the most unlikely vessels into carriers of his perfect love. Thank you for staying with us and opening your heart to this incredible journey. It means more than words can say. As you've listened, may your soul be uplifted and your day filled with grace and peace, knowing that the same God who transformed Jonathan is ready to transform you too. This story holds something truly special, and we pray it has touched your heart deeply. If this message has moved you, please subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know you're walking this path of faith with us. Your presence here is a true blessing, and remember, no matter what you're facing today, redemption is always possible. God's love never gives up, never runs out, and never fails to find a way to bring beauty from the broken pieces of our lives.